Her name is Grace. She is 28 years old. She is 8 months pregnant. She is lying on a road in Memphis, Tennessee, in the rain, at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in October, and the house behind her, the house with the lights still burning in the front window, is the house she has lived in for 2 years. The man inside it is the man she married. The woman who told him to put her there is the woman who raised him. And the door is locked from the inside. What happens in the next 4 minutes, and then in the 14 months that follow, is the reason we are telling Grace Morrison's story tonight. Not because of what was done to her, because of what she did about it. Stay with me. Everything is coming. None of it will arrive the way you are expecting. Before we go any further, I need to put 3 questions in front of you. 3 questions that are going to hold every minute of this story together, and that you are going to be turning over in your mind long after this video ends. The first is the one that is going to make you angry before we are 5 minutes into this. How does a man who stood at an altar, in a church, in front of his family and his pastor, and made a promise to God and to the woman beside him, how does that man decide, 2 years later, that his 8 months pregnant wife belongs on a road in the rain in October with no coat, no shoes, and a locked door between her and everything she owns? What was happening inside that house that the neighbors never saw? What does that kind of decision look like while it is still being made? The second question is the one that will stay with you. Where was Grace supposed to go? She had $63 in a bank account that her husband monitored. Her phone was on the kitchen counter on the other side of a locked door. Her grandmother was 40 minutes away and had no idea any of this was happening because Grace had stopped telling her the truth a long time ago. So where do you go when the person who was supposed to be your home has become the most dangerous place in your world? And the third question, the one whose answer changes the entire shape of this story, is this: why did that car stop? Because a car does turn onto that road at 11:31 that night, and it does stop. And the woman who gets out of it is not a police officer or a social worker. She is a night shift nurse on her way home from a 12-hour shift. She is tired. She has every reason in the world to keep driving. So why didn't she? Hold on to those 3 questions. We are going to answer every single one of them tonight. And none of the answers will be what you think they are. And before we go any deeper into Grace's story, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let us go back to the beginning. All the way back to the woman Grace was before any of this happened. Because to understand what she survived, you first have to understand what she was made of. And what Grace Morrison was made of is the kind of thing that takes a lifetime to build and only shows itself completely when everything around it tries to break it. Grace Williams grew up in South Memphis, in a house on Kerr Avenue that belonged to her grandmother, Beatrice Williams, Nana B, as everyone who knew her called her, who took Grace in when Grace was 9 years old after the car accident on a rainy November night that took Grace's mother and father from her in a single moment on a highway outside of Shelby County. Grace does not talk about that night very often. What she talks about, when she talks about her childhood, is the house on Kerr Avenue. She talks about how it smelled, her grandmother's cooking, lavender from the sachets Nana be kept in every drawer, the specific clean smell of a home that was kept with the kind of devotion that some people reserve for sacred spaces. She talks about the way the front porch felt on summer evenings, the two of them in mismatched chairs. Nana be talking about her day while Grace did her homework on a TV tray beside her. She talks about the singing, because in that house on Kerr Avenue, there was always singing. Beatrice Williams was a church woman in the specific and irreducible way of Black grandmothers in South Memphis who have survived things that would have ended other people, and who decided, somewhere on the other side of survival, that joy was not optional. It was a responsibility. She had lost a daughter. She had taken in a granddaughter. And she had decided, with the kind of quiet, unspoken, absolute conviction that some people carry their whole lives without ever needing to say it out loud, that she was going to pour everything she had into making Grace Williams into a woman who could not be destroyed. Not because the world was safe. Nana B knew better than anyone that it was not. But because a woman who knows who she is can survive almost anything. Nana B taught Grace to cook, to pray, to sing, to speak her mind clearly and without apology, and to love people with everything she had, holding nothing back. That last lesson, the lesson about loving without reservation, would come back to Grace in ways that Nana B never intended. But the woman it built was the woman who got up off that road. Grace joined the choir at Greater Harvest Baptist Church when she was 11 years old. By 14, she was singing lead on Sunday mornings, and the congregation, which had known her since she arrived at 9 years old, small and quiet and wrapped in her grandmother's coat, had watched her grow from a child who flinched at loud sounds into a young woman who could stand at a microphone in front of 300 people and make them feel, in the space of 4 minutes, every emotion the human heart is capable of feeling. She graduated from Whitehaven High School, completed her early childhood education certification at Southwest Tennessee Community College, and went to work at a daycare center on Chelsea Avenue called Little Hands Learning Center, where the children drew pictures of her and taped them to her locker and called her Miss Grace in the specific, full-voiced way of small children who have decided that a person matters to them. She was, at 25, one of the most completely and genuinely herself people that anyone who knew her could describe. She had survived grief. She had built a life. She had not yet learned that some dangers do not announce themselves. Darius Morrison was 36 years old when he walked into Greater Harvest Baptist on a Sunday morning in March and sat in the third pew from the front, which was where the choir processed, and Grace Williams, singing the opening processional with her eyes forward and her voice full and her hands clasped in front of her the way Nana B had taught her, looked down the aisle and saw him looking at her, and felt something she would spend the next 3 years trying to understand. He was tall, well-dressed, church-going. He had a calm about him that read, from a distance, as the calm of a man who had made peace with himself. He introduced himself after service in the parking lot, complimented the choir, shook Pastor Howard's hand, and asked Grace if she would allow him to take her to lunch. He said it exactly that way. "Would you allow me?" Which Grace noticed, and which Nana B noticed when Grace told her about it that afternoon, and which Nana B said nothing about, because Nana B had lived long enough to know that the way a person asks for something the first time is almost never the way they ask for it once they believe it already belongs to them. What Grace saw in Darius Morrison in those early months was the thing she had been quietly hoping for since she was old enough to understand what hoping for something meant. He was stable. He had a job, project manager at a logistics company in East Memphis, good salary, his own apartment that he kept immaculate, and that he showed her on their 4th date with the particular pride of a man showing you something he built himself. He was attentive in ways that felt, in those early months, like fluency in the language of care. He remembered things, not just big things, but the small specific details that Grace mentioned in passing and that most people let go immediately. She had told him, on their 2nd date, that her favorite flowers were birds of paradise because her mother had kept them in the house, and Grace had one photograph where her mother was holding a bunch of them and smiling. 3 weeks later, he arrived at her door with a single bird of paradise in a glass vase and said, "I was just thinking about your mother today." Grace stood in the doorway of her apartment and felt something in her chest that she would later describe as the specific sensation of being truly seen by another person for the first time in a very long time. What she could not see then, what no one outside a relationship like the one she was being drawn into can ever see in time, was that this was not presence. It was preparation. Darius Morrison proposed to Grace Williams 11 months after they met, in the parking lot of Greater Harvest Baptist after the Sunday morning service, in front of approximately 40 members of the congregation who had been tipped off by the pastor the week before. He got down on one knee with a ring that Grace would later learn was purchased on a credit card he did not tell her about. The congregation applauded. Grace said yes. Nana B., who was standing 6 feet away and who had been watching Darius Morrison with the specific, patient attention of a woman who has been reading people for 7 decades, said nothing in that moment. She hugged Grace. She shook Darius's hand. She looked at him for a long second. And later that afternoon, in the kitchen on Kerr Avenue while Grace was on the phone with her friends, Nana B. stood at the sink with her hands in dishwater and thought about what she had seen in his eyes when she looked at him. She told Grace 2 weeks before the wedding that she wanted Grace to be happy above all things. She did not say what else she was thinking. Nana B. had lived too long to say things that could not yet be proven, but she kept thinking them. Elaine Morrison had raised Darius by herself in Orange Mound after his father, Marcus Morrison, left when Darius was 4 years old and did not come back. She had worked as a city clerk in the Shelby County government for 27 years, raised her son on that income alone, put him through college, watched him build his career, and somewhere in those 32 years of singular devotion had built a version of her son in her mind that required a very specific kind of woman beside him. A woman Elaine had been in the process of identifying and rejecting for as long as Darius had been bringing women home. There had been 3 before Grace. Each one had lasted between 8 months and 2 years. Each one had left the relationship with the specific, quietly devastated expression of a woman who had tried her best and could not identify exactly where the ground had given way beneath her. None of them had ever been able to point to a single thing Elaine had said or done that could be called cruel. And that inability to point at the specific thing, was not an accident. It was the entire method. Grace met Elaine Morrison 6 weeks after the engagement, at a dinner at Elaine's house in Orange Mound that Darius described as just a casual get-together, which it was not. Elaine had cooked for 4 hours. The table was set with her good china. She was dressed formally, and she greeted Grace at the door with a smile so warm and so sustained that Grace felt, walking into that house, that she had passed some kind of test she had not known she was taking. Dinner was lovely on the surface, but somewhere between the main course and the dessert, Elaine said something that Grace would think about for a long time afterward. She said it while looking at Grace's hands, Grace's working hands, the hands of a woman who worked in a daycare and did not have a manicure. And she said, Darius has always needed someone who could keep up with him. Just something to keep in mind as you plan your future. She said it with a smile. She said it in the tone of a woman offering helpful advice to a young person she was rooting for. And Grace smiled back and said thank you and did not say what she was actually thinking, which was that she had no idea what that meant or why it had been said. She would understand both things much later. By then, it would be far too late to act on the understanding. Grace and Darius were married on a Saturday in June at Greater Harvest Baptist, and they moved 3 weeks later into a house in the Whitehaven neighborhood of Memphis. A 2-story brick house on a quiet residential street with a covered porch and a backyard with a silver maple tree that Grace loved immediately and that she told Darius, on the evening of the day they moved in, made the whole house feel like a home. Darius smiled and said, "It does now that you are in it." And Grace believed him. She would spend the next several months believing everything he told her, because nothing in those first months of the marriage gave her a reason not to. The house was peaceful. Darius was present. Sunday dinners with Elaine were the only thing that made Grace's stomach tighten slightly, but she told herself that was normal, that all new wives navigate a mother-in-law, and that patience was the answer, and she managed those dinners with the same warmth and the same effort and the same willingness to give the benefit of the doubt that she brought to everything in her life. The first sign that something in the marriage was not what it appeared to be came 3 months in, and it came in such a small, quiet form that Grace would not recognize it as a sign for another year and a half. It came in the form of a conversation about money. Darius sat down with Grace one evening with both of their bank statements spread on the kitchen table and proposed what he described as a practical system for managing their household finances. He suggested that all income flow through a joint account that he managed, with a debit card for Grace for daily expenses, groceries, gas, small purchases, and that any larger expense be discussed before being made. He framed it as responsible planning. He used the word together more than once. He said, "I just want us to be a team about this." And Grace, who had grown up watching Nana stretch every dollar with the precision of an engineer and who respected financial discipline as a genuine value, agreed. She said, "That makes sense to me." She did not notice, in that moment, that the system he was proposing was one in which all of the control resided with him and none of it resided with her. She would not notice that for a long time. That is how these things work. They don't arrive as what they are. They arrive as something that sounds reasonable. The friendship with Tamara was the second thing to go, and it went the same way, quietly, through a process so gradual that Grace could not identify the moment it happened. Tamara Johnson had been Grace's best friend since the 4th grade at Sherwood Elementary. She was the maid of honor at the wedding. She was the person Grace called when anything happened, good or bad, before she called anyone else. And she was the first person who said, directly and clearly, that something about Darius felt wrong to her. She said it once, at a dinner 3 months after the wedding. Just the two of them. And she said it carefully, not as an accusation, but as the specific, caring observation of a person who knows someone well enough to notice a change. She said, "Grace, you seem smaller. You seem like you are watching what you say." And Grace said, "I am just adjusting to being a wife." And Tamara said, "Okay, but call me if anything changes." That was the last real conversation they had for 14 months. Because every time Grace mentioned Tamara after that, Tamara called, "Tamara and I are thinking about getting lunch." Darius had a response. Not a prohibition. Never a prohibition. Just a response. A question about Tamara's intentions. A comment about whether Tamara was the kind of influence that supported what Grace and Darius were building together. A wondering, offered gently, about whether Tamara was truly happy for them or whether her friendship came with an agenda. Grace chose the path of least resistance because she loved her husband and she wanted peace. She stopped mentioning Tamara. Tamara's calls went to voicemail. The voicemail filled up and Grace stopped listening to it. By the 8th month of the marriage, Grace's world had contracted in ways she was only beginning to be able to measure. She had $63 she could access without a conversation. She had no friendships she had maintained fully. She had stopped telling Nana the truth about things, not in a single decision, but in a series of small edits, small reassurances, small versions of the truth that kept Nana from worrying and also kept Grace from having to say out loud what she was beginning to understand. She went to Sunday dinners at Elaine's and absorbed Elaine's comments and smiled and thanked Elaine for the food and drove home beside Darius in silence and told herself that she was being strong. She was not being strong. She was disappearing, slowly, by degrees, in a house that looked perfectly fine from the outside and felt like a slowly tightening room from the inside. And then she found out she was pregnant. And for approximately 3 weeks, she believed that the pregnancy was going to change everything. Grace discovered she was pregnant on a Thursday morning in the 2nd spring of her marriage. She sat in the bathroom with the test for a long time before she went downstairs. Not because she was afraid of Darius's response, but because she had learned, by that point, to run his likely responses through a private calculation before any significant conversation. She had learned to approach him from the right angle, at the right time, with the right framing, in the way that a person learns these things when they have been living in a managed environment long enough to have mapped its geography. She told him over breakfast, gently, carefully, watching his face. And his face did something she had not seen from him in months. It opened. He held her. He said the things a husband is supposed to say, that he was so happy, that this was everything, that they were going to be the best parents. He called his mother. He called his sister. He went to the first prenatal appointment and held Grace's hand and asked the doctor questions and was, for those 3 weeks, the version of himself that Grace had fallen in love with in the parking lot of Greater Harvest. Grace called Nana B that evening and said, "Nana, I think things are going to be okay." Nana B said, "I pray you're right, baby." And then, "Are you taking care of yourself?" And Grace said, "Yes, ma'am." She was not, but she was trying. Elaine's response to the pregnancy was delivered at the Sunday dinner that followed the announcement, and it was delivered in Elaine's particular style, as a comment, not a statement, as concern, not criticism, as love, not warning. She waited until the dinner was nearly finished and the conversation had moved to the baby's room and the colors Grace was thinking about. And then Elaine looked at Grace across the table with the warm, sustained smile she deployed for these moments and said, "I hope you understand what you're taking on. Motherhood is not easy for everyone. Some women are naturally built for it, and some women have to work much harder to find their footing. I'm sure you'll manage, with the right support." She said it pleasantly. She said it in the tone of someone rooting for Grace. She said it while looking at Darius for one brief moment in a way that Grace caught and could not decode. And Darius said nothing. He reached across the table and refilled his mother's water glass. And Grace sat with Elaine's words and the smile they had arrived in and tried to separate them from each other and found, as she always found, that they could not be separated. The smile was part of the weapon. The smile was the delivery mechanism. And there was no way to respond to it without looking as though you were responding to kindness with suspicion. The 6th and 7th months of the pregnancy were the months when the management that had been quiet and consistent for nearly 2 years became something else. Darius stopped being careful. That is the only way to describe what happened, and it matters that you understand what it means. He had been careful for 22 months. Careful in the specific, sustained way of a man who understands that the version of himself he presents in public requires maintenance, and who had been doing that maintenance consistently since before the wedding. The version of Darius that existed at church, at work, at family dinners, in the neighborhood, that version was present and engaged and gave no indication of anything wrong. But in the house, in the evenings, in the hours when Elaine had come and gone, and there was no audience left, Grace Morrison began to say out loud the things he had been communicating for 2 years through tone and implication and carefully chosen silence. He told Grace she was a burden. He told her that her job at the daycare was an embarrassment to him. He told her that her background, the dead parents, the grandmother-raised childhood, the education that stopped at a community college, was evidence of a ceiling she was never going to get above, and that he had spent 2 years trying to ignore that ceiling and had run out of the patience to continue. He said these things not in anger. That is the part that was most difficult for Grace to explain later, and the part that she most needed people to understand. He said them the way you state a fact, in the voice of a man who has been holding a conclusion for a long time and has decided there is no longer a reason to hold it. By the start of the 8th month, Elaine was at the house 4 and 5 days a week. She moved through it with the ease of a woman who has decided, without ever saying so, that the house belongs to her in a way that no legal document will confirm, but that daily presence will eventually make undeniable. She reorganized the kitchen. She had opinions about the nursery that she offered as suggestions and pressed as requirements. She and Darius had conversations that began before Grace entered the room and ended the moment she did, in the specific, practiced way of two people who have been having a parallel conversation for a long time and have learned how to make it invisible. Grace was 8 months pregnant, increasingly unable to move comfortably, isolated from every person outside that house who might have helped her understand what she was living inside, with $63 in an account that Darius checked every week. She was not naive. She understood, by then, with a clarity she had been avoiding for over a year, exactly what her situation was. She had been making a plan. The plan required time. And time, it turned out, was the one thing she was about to run out of. The Tuesday in October started ordinarily. Grace had spent the morning at a prenatal appointment alone. Darius had meetings he said he could not move, and had come home to find Elaine already in the kitchen, having let herself in with the key she had always had, making a dinner that Grace had not been consulted about in a kitchen that Grace had been trying, for months, to think of as her own. Grace greeted Elaine, changed her clothes, came downstairs, and sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the particular internal preparation of a woman who has learned to manage every evening in this house as its own small operation. Darius came home at 6. The three of them sat at the dinner table. The conversation moved around Grace the way it always did, between Elaine and Darius, about people Grace barely knew and events she had not been included in. And then Grace said something. It was not a provocative thing. It was a practical thing. She had been thinking about the hospital bag she had packed, and she mentioned that she had put in a particular item for the baby, something small, a little outfit with a specific color, and she said the color. She said she had chosen yellow because she didn't know yet if the baby was a boy or a girl. Elaine set down her fork. She looked at Darius. And the specific quality of that look, the way information passed between them in the space of 2 seconds, a decision reached without a word, hit Grace in the chest before she understood what it contained. She found out what it contained in the hour that followed. Grace described that hour to a judge 13 months later in testimony that lasted 47 minutes, and that the judge, a woman named the Honorable Denise Watkins, later said was among the most precise and composed accounts of domestic violence she had heard in 22 years on the family court bench. Grace described the voices first. She described Darius standing up from the table. She described what happened in the sequence it happened, without embellishment and without omission. She described Elaine standing in the kitchen doorway and watching and not moving. She described reaching the front door. She described stepping through it. She described the rain, which was already heavy, and the cold, which was immediate and complete, and the sound of the lock turning behind her. She described looking down at herself and realizing she had no coat, no shoes. She had taken them off when she came home that afternoon, and they were just inside the door. No phone, no keys, no wallet. She described walking to the middle of the road because she needed to put distance between herself and the house. She described going to the ground because her body needed to be low and her arms needed to be around the baby. And she described lying there in the rain with her cheek against the asphalt and her eyes open, looking at the road surface from 3 inches away and making a decision. Not a decision about whether to survive. She had already made that decision years ago, in a hospital waiting room when she was 9 years old and a doctor told her that her mother and father were gone. The decision she made in the road was different. The decision she made was about who she was going to be when she got up, about what she was going to do with everything that had just happened to her, about the fact that the baby inside her, the baby she had already named Imani, which means faith in Swahili, a name she had chosen from a book of names 2 months earlier sitting in the nursery by herself one Saturday morning, was going to be born in a world where her mother had gotten up off a road in the rain and had not allowed that road to be the end of her story. And then Grace Morrison saw headlights at the end of the street. Patricia Okafor had been an emergency medicine nurse for 31 years. She had worked the night shift at Regional Medical Center in Memphis for the better part of 2 decades, which meant she had driven home on the same roads, at the same hours, in every kind of weather this city produces, more times than she could count. She was 58 years old, and she had seen, in those 31 years of emergency nursing, approximately everything that one human being can do to another human body. She had developed, through those 31 years, a specific and finely calibrated clinical instinct. Not the instinct of someone who has read about trauma, but the instinct of someone who has spent 31 years in the room with it. She knew, within the first 30 seconds of encountering a patient, what had happened to them. Not always the details, but the shape of it, the origin of it, whether the story she was going to be told matched the body she was looking at. She was driving home on that Tuesday night in October, the radio low on the gospel station she always kept on for the drive, 22 minutes from her house, tired in the specific way of a person who has made consequential decisions about other people's lives for 12 consecutive hours and is now ready, more than ready, to make no decisions at all. Her headlights found Grace from approximately 40 feet away. She saw a shape on the road that did not belong there. She slowed. She stopped. She got out of her car. Patricia has told the story of the next 45 seconds in the same words every time she has been asked. She says she got out of the car, walked to the woman on the road, knelt down, and her knees, which are not what they were at 35, have reminded her of this decision every day since. And she put one hand on Grace's shoulder. She says the first thing she did was the thing she had done at the beginning of every patient interaction for 31 years. She made sure the person knew she was there. She did not know Grace's name. So she said, "I see you. I am here. You are not alone." And then she did her clinical assessment. Airway, breathing, circulation, the 8-month pregnancy immediately visible and immediately the most urgent concern. And she said 4 words that she has said many times in many situations across 31 years of emergency nursing, and that she says hit differently when you are saying them to someone on a road in the rain at 11:30 at night. She said, "I have got you." Grace told me later that she did not cry when Patricia said those words. She said she was past the point where crying was available to her. What she felt instead, she said, was something she found the name for 6 months later in a therapist's office. She said, "It was like somebody finally turned on a light in a room I had forgotten was dark." She said, "I had been so long in the dark I had stopped knowing it was dark." Patricia did not take Grace home. She took Grace directly to the Regional Medical Center emergency room, where she worked, where she knew the staff on duty, where she knew the protocols for exactly this kind of presentation. She stayed. This is the part that Grace still has difficulty talking about without her voice changing. Patricia had just finished a 12-hour shift. She was 30 minutes from her own bed. She had a daughter who was expecting a call from her. She had a full day ahead of her the following morning. She stayed for 4 hours. She sat in a chair outside the examination room with a cup of vending machine coffee. She did not drink, and she waited. When the attending physician on duty, a doctor named Marcus Webb who had worked alongside Patricia for 9 years, came to give her the findings of Grace's examination in the specific, careful language that emergency physicians use when they are describing findings that have both clinical and legal dimensions, Patricia listened. And when he was finished, she sat with what he had told her for a long moment. And then she went back in to see Grace. Grace was sitting up in the hospital bed with both hands resting on her abdomen, both hands curved around the baby, protective even in the middle of everything. And Grace looked at her and said, "Thank you for stopping." Patricia said, "I was always going to stop." Grace said, "How did you know?" Patricia said, "Because I could see you from 40 feet away. And someone who can be seen from 40 feet away is someone who is still trying to be found." While Grace was in the emergency room, Darius Morrison called his mother at 12:19 in the morning. The call lasted 7 minutes. Grace's attorney would obtain those phone records 10 months later through a subpoena, and while the content of the call was not on record, what happened the following morning was because a woman named Mrs. Loretta Caldwell, who had lived on the same block of Whitehaven for 27 years and who watched her neighborhood with the attentiveness of a person who had decided, a long time ago, that paying attention to what happened around her was a form of civic duty, had been awake that Tuesday night. She heard things. She wrote them down. She had been writing things down in a spiral notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer for years, noting dates and times and descriptions, the way her own mother had taught her to keep records of everything, because records are the only thing that cannot be argued away. At 8:43 the following morning, Mrs. Caldwell was at her kitchen window with her morning coffee when she saw Darius Morrison come out of the front door of the house across the street carrying the first of 3 garbage bags. He made 3 trips. He placed the bags on the front porch. He went back inside. At 9:11 he came out again, got into his car, and drove away. Mrs. Caldwell wrote all of it down in her notebook. She wrote the time of each trip and what the bags looked like and which direction his car went. She did not know, on that Wednesday morning, that she was building one of the most important pieces of evidence in a court proceeding. She was just doing what she had always done, paying attention. Darius Morrison drove to his mother's house in Orange Mound, and he stayed there. He did not call the hospital. He did not call Nana B. He did not file a missing persons report for his 8 months pregnant wife, who had been lying on a road in the rain at 11:30 the previous night. He sat in his mother's house, and he waited. He was waiting because he had built, across 22 months, a situation in which Grace had no money, no phone, no friends, no one who knew the full truth of what she had been living inside, and nowhere to go. He had done the math. He had run the calculation. He was certain that within 48, perhaps 72 hours, Grace would contact him. She would have no choice. That was the entire architecture of what he had built, an architecture of dependency so complete that escape seemed impossible from the inside. What Darius Morrison had not calculated was that Grace had been found by Patricia Okafor, who had 31 years of emergency medicine behind her and a personal phone number for an attorney who picked up at 2 in the morning. What he had not calculated was that Patricia had also found Grace's phone, which had slipped from her coat pocket and landed on the ground near the front door during the chaos of that hour, cracked screen face down in the rain, and had returned it to her at the hospital. And what he had not calculated was what Grace Morrison did first, in the early hours of that Wednesday morning, with that phone in her hand and Patricia sitting in the chair beside her bed. Grace called her grandmother. Beatrice Williams was 73 years old and had not had a full, uninterrupted night of sleep in more years than she could count. So when her phone lit up at 2:17 in the morning with a number she did not immediately recognize, Grace's phone number had changed twice in 2 years, and Nana B had noted that, but not asked about it. She was awake, and she answered. Grace said, "Nana, it's me." And Nana B said, "I know it's you, baby. Tell me." And Grace told her. All of it. Not the edited version, not the version that protected Nana B from worry, not the version that kept the peace. The whole truth, from the beginning, in the flat, clear, factual voice of a woman who has decided that the time for managing other people's feelings about her situation is completely and permanently over. She talked for 22 minutes. Patricia Okafor, sitting in the chair beside the bed, has described those 22 minutes as one of the most important conversations she ever witnessed. Not because of the words alone, but because of the quality of listening on the other end of that phone. Nana B did not gasp. She did not interrupt. She did not say she couldn't believe it or ask how Grace had let this happen. She listened, completely, all the way through. And when Grace finished speaking, there was a silence that lasted approximately 10 seconds. And then Nana B said 3 words. She said, "I'm already dressed." She put the phone down. She picked up her car keys. And at 4:40 in the morning, she knocked on the entrance door of the Regional Medical Center emergency room, having driven 40 minutes in the rain without telling Grace she was coming, because telling Grace she was coming would have given Grace the opportunity to say it was too far or too late or too much trouble. And Beatrice Williams was not going to give her granddaughter the opportunity to tell her not to come. Grace was in a room on the second floor when the nurse came in and said, "Your grandmother is here." And Grace said, "What?" Because she had not told Nana B which hospital. She had not told her the address. Nana B had called Regional Medical Center, which was the largest emergency facility in the area, and said, "I'm looking for my granddaughter, Grace Williams Morrison. She was brought in tonight." And they had confirmed it. And Nana B had driven to that hospital and walked through the entrance at 4:40 in the morning in her good coat with her purse on her arm and her face composed and her eyes absolutely clear. She walked into Grace's room. She stood at the door for a moment, taking in the hospital bed and the monitors and the evidence of what had been done to her granddaughter. And then she crossed the room, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she took Grace's face in both her hands. Both hands. The way she had held Grace's face when Grace was 9 years old, and a doctor had just told them both something that neither of them would ever fully recover from. And she looked at her. Grace, who had not cried since the road, who had been running on the specific adrenaline of a person who has decided something and is now executing on that decision, who had been composed and clear and deliberate through every minute of that night, began to cry. Not in collapse. In the specific, enormous relief of someone who has been carrying something alone for so long that having another person simply present, simply there, with their hands on your face, is too much to bear silently. She cried, and Nana beheld her face and said, "I should have known sooner." And Grace said, "I didn't let you." And Nana B said, "I know. I should have known anyway. That is on me. Not on you. On me." And they sat like that for a long time, in a hospital room in Memphis at 5 in the morning, while Patricia Okafor quietly got her things and stepped out into the hallway, because she understood that what was happening in that room needed no witnesses. Patricia Okafor had been working emergency medicine in Memphis for 31 years, and in that time she had found herself, on more occasions than any formal job description had ever prepared her for, in the position of being the first person with both the ability and the will to do something about a situation like Grace's. She had a network, not a program, not a government initiative, not a hotline. A human network, built over 31 years of night shifts and parking lot conversations and introductions made at church and in waiting rooms and over the phone at 2 in the morning. The first person she called, at 2:45 on that Wednesday morning, was a woman named Attorney Renee Carter, who had been practicing family and domestic law in Memphis for 17 years and who had given Patricia her personal cell number 5 years earlier with instructions to use it without hesitation when it was needed. Renee Carter answered on the second ring. Patricia gave her the facts in the concise, clinical, exactly what you need to know format of a woman who has been giving reports in emergency situations for 3 decades. Renee said, "I'll be there at 6. She was there at 6:15, with a legal pad and 2 cups of coffee from the hospital cafeteria, and she sat beside Grace's bed for 3 hours. Renee Carter was, by any account from anyone who had worked with her, exactly the kind of attorney you want in a situation like Grace's. Not because she was aggressive or theatrical, she was neither of those things, but because she was precise. She asked questions the way a surgeon operates. No wasted movement, nothing removed that didn't need to come out, nothing left behind that would cause damage later. She reviewed the hospital documentation that had been generated the night before, documentation that Marcus Webb, the attending physician, had completed with exactly the kind of thoroughness that a physician who has worked alongside Patricia Okafor for 9 years, understands is necessary in these situations. She reviewed the photographs. She listened to Grace's account of the 22 months of the marriage with the specific, non-reactive attention of a professional who is simultaneously building empathy and building a legal file and understands that these are not competing activities. And at the end of 3 hours, she told Grace 4 things. First, what Darius Morrison had done on the Tuesday night in October constituted criminal domestic assault in Tennessee, and the physical evidence to support that charge existed and was documented. Second, the financial control he had exercised across 22 months constituted a pattern of coercive control that Tennessee courts were increasingly recognizing as a distinct form of domestic abuse. Third, the custody threat that Renee was certain Darius would make was a tactical document designed to create fear, and they were not going to respond to it as though it were anything else. And fourth, she had already called the Shelby County District Attorney's Office to put them on notice. She said, "I want to file before he files. Are you ready?" Grace looked at Nana B in the chair across the room. Nana B gave her the specific look of a woman who has driven 40 minutes in the rain at 4 in the morning and is not interested in anything other than her granddaughter's complete and total answer. Grace said, "File." There is a detail that Renee Carter considers one of the most important pieces of evidence she has encountered in 17 years of practice, and it did not come from the hospital, and it did not come from a subpoena. It came from a knock on her office door 3 days after the filing, when a woman named Loretta Caldwell walked in with a spiral notebook and sat down across from Renee's desk and placed the notebook on the surface between them and said, "I've been keeping this for 27 years. I think it's finally time it was useful." Mrs. Caldwell had 41 separate entries in that notebook relating to the Morrison house. Dates, times, descriptions of vehicles, records of who came and went and when. The entry for the Tuesday evening noted that Elaine Morrison's car had arrived at 4:14 in the afternoon. It noted that the front door had been opened and closed at 11:22 at night. It noted a sound, described in Mrs. Caldwell's careful handwriting as a disturbance inside the house, duration approximately 45 minutes, followed by the front door opening and remaining open for approximately 30 seconds and then closing. And then it noted, the following morning, the 3 trips with the bags. All of it in the same careful, dated, timed handwriting. Renee Carter looked at that notebook for a long time, and then she looked at Mrs. Caldwell and said, "Ma'am, you may have just been the most important witness I have ever had." Mrs. Caldwell said, "I just did what my mother taught me." She said, "Keep records of everything, because the truth doesn't defend itself. I was just following instructions." Darius Morrison was served with the filing at his office on a Thursday afternoon, 10 days after the Tuesday night. His administrative assistant, a woman named Keisha Brown who had worked for him for 3 years, described what happened when Darius read the first page. She said he sat very still, not the stillness of a man reading, the stillness of a man whose calculation has just been returned to him with a different answer than the one he expected. He sat still for approximately 2 full minutes, and then he called his mother. Before we get to the courtroom, there is one more thing that happened in those weeks that does not appear in any legal filing, that will never appear in any court record, and that Grace considers the most important thing that happened in the entire 14 months between the Tuesday night and the day the judge issued her ruling. And that thing happened on a Saturday morning at Nana Bea's house on Kerr Avenue, when someone knocked on the door and Grace opened it and found Tamara Johnson on the porch with a casserole dish and her own 4-year-old daughter on her hip, and a look on her face that contained not one single atom of anything that resembled "I told you so." Renee Carter had found Tamara through a mutual contact, had called her and explained the situation in brief and factual terms, and had given her the Kerr Avenue address. Tamara had not asked questions. She had said, I'm coming Saturday." She arrived at 11 in the morning with the casserole and her daughter and a pie that Nana B immediately claimed as evidence of good character. She sat down at the kitchen table. She took Grace's hand. She said, "I'm here." And that was the entirety of what she said for the first few minutes. Grace had been afraid of this moment, if she was honest, afraid of what Tamara might feel entitled to say after 14 months of unanswered calls and a friendship that had been managed out of existence by a man who understood that isolation was the most important tool in his kit. But Tamara said none of those things. She sat there and she held Grace's hand, and when Grace started to apologize, Tamara said, "Stop. There is nothing for you to apologize for. I know what happened. I'm not here for an apology. I'm here because you're my person, and that has not changed for 1 second of the 14 months that you could not reach me, and it is not going to change." And Grace cried again, for the second time in 2 weeks, and Tamara's daughter, who was 4 years old and had no concept of what was happening except that there was a baby coming, and that was the most interesting thing she had ever heard, walked over and patted Grace's knee and said, "Don't be sad. The baby is going to be so cute." And everyone at that table laughed. And laughter, in that kitchen, on that Saturday morning, felt like the first clean breath Grace had taken in 2 years. Imani Grace Morrison was born on a Friday morning in November, 3 weeks after the Tuesday in October, at Regional Medical Center, the same hospital where Patricia had brought Grace that first night. She weighed 6 pounds and 9 ounces. She was completely healthy. She arrived in the world with a voice that, according to everyone present, filled the entire delivery room from the first second and showed absolutely no intention of lowering itself. Patricia Okafor was in the waiting room. She had come in on her day off. She had not told Grace she was coming because she knew Grace would say it was too much. Nana B was in the delivery room, had been there for 9 hours, was holding Grace's hand when Imani arrived, and was the first person outside the medical staff to hold her. Patricia came into the room an hour after the birth and stood in the doorway for a moment before she walked in. She said later, "I needed a minute. I had been carrying what I saw on that road for 3 weeks. And then I walked into that room, and I saw Grace holding Imani, and I thought, that is what the road was for. Everything that road cost Grace was so that this room could happen. And I needed a minute with that before I could walk in." She walked in. She looked at the baby. Nana B said, "Isn't she something?" Patricia said, "She's everything." Grace looked up from the baby's face and looked at Patricia across the room and said, "Thank you for stopping." And Patricia said, the same thing she had said that night on the road, "I was always going to stop." The family court hearing took place over 3 days in the January following Imani's birth. Grace attended with Renee Carter and with Nana B, who sat in the gallery in her good coat with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed in the specific, settled expression of a woman who has prepared herself for a fight and has made peace in advance with whatever the outcome is, because the preparation itself was an act of love, and love is its own reward regardless of the verdict. Darius arrived with his attorney, a man named Gregory Ford, who had a reputation in Memphis family court for being capable and aggressive in equal measure. And Elaine arrived and sat directly behind her son and had on her face the warm, composed, and entirely unreadable expression that she had been wearing to every significant moment in his life since he was 4 years old and his father left, and she had decided that her face would never again give anything away that she had not chosen to give. Darius's attorney presented the version of events that Darius had been constructing since the night in October. He described a troubled marriage. He described Grace as a woman who had left the marital home voluntarily, without discussion, in an emotional state. He described Darius as a concerned husband who had been attempting to locate his wife and maintain contact with his unborn child. He noted that Grace was currently residing with an elderly relative in what he described as a transitional arrangement and suggested that this was not an optimal environment for a newborn. He presented a character statement from Darius's pastor, who had known him for 12 years and who described him as a devoted churchgoer and a man of integrity. He presented statements from two colleagues who described him as professional, even-tempered, and reliable. He painted, in the specific language of family court proceedings, the portrait of a man who had been unfairly abandoned by an unstable wife who was now, with the assistance of an attorney, attempting to leverage a complicated domestic situation into a legal advantage. It was a thorough presentation. It was well organized. And it was the version of events that worked perfectly in the absence of Mrs. Caldwell's notebook, the hospital documentation, the subpoenaed phone records, and 31 years of Patricia Okafor's clinical judgment. Renee Carter did not raise her voice once across the 3 days of the hearing. She did not need to. She had a different tool. She had documentation. She had the emergency room report, which described Grace's injuries in the specific, clinical, photographic detail of a medical record that does not editorialize and does not soften and does not leave room for alternative interpretation. She had the joint account records, spanning 22 months, which showed with mathematical precision the management of Grace's financial access, the deposits, the controlled withdrawals, the $63 balance on the Tuesday night. She had the phone records, the 7-minute call from Darius to Elaine at 12:19 in the morning. She had Mrs. Caldwell's notarized statement, with all 41 entries, including the specific entry for the Tuesday evening noting the arrival of Elaine's car at 4:14, the disturbance, the door, and the bags the following morning. And she had Grace's testimony. 47 minutes of testimony, delivered in the flat, precise, completely composed voice of a woman who has prepared for this moment for months and understands that composure is the most powerful thing she can bring into this room. Renee presented it all, piece by piece, without theater, without rhetorical flourish, in the way that the truth is best presented when you want it to land and stay landed. The cross-examination of Elaine Morrison took 43 minutes. Renee asked Elaine to describe, in her own words, what she had observed on the Tuesday evening in October in the Morrison home, in the hour before Grace was found on the road outside. Elaine said she did not recall the specifics. She said it had been an emotional evening, that tensions had been high in the marriage for some time, that she had tried her best to be a supportive presence for both of them. Renee placed Mrs. Caldwell's notarized statement on the table in front of her and asked her to read the entry for 4:14 in the afternoon of the Tuesday in October. Elaine read it. Renee asked her to read the entry noting the sound and the open door at 11:22. Elaine read it. Renee placed the phone record in front of her, the 12:19 call, 7 minutes, her son's number to her number, and asked her to explain in her own words what she and Darius had discussed for 7 minutes in the middle of the night after his 8 months pregnant wife had been found on a road by a passing stranger. Elaine said, "I don't remember the specifics of that call." Renee said, "Take your time." The courtroom was quiet. Elaine looked at the phone record. She looked at her hands. She looked, briefly, at Darius, who was looking at the table. She looked at the phone record again. Renee waited. The room stayed quiet. The Honorable Judge Denise Watkins, who had been presiding over family court proceedings in Shelby County for 22 years and who had, over those 22 years, developed the ability to read a room with the accuracy of a person who does it professionally, watched Elaine Morrison sit in that silence. And then she wrote something on the pad in front of her. The Honorable Judge Denise Watkins issued her ruling on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days after the conclusion of testimony. She awarded primary custody of Imani Grace Morrison to Grace. She issued an emergency protective order against Darius Morrison, requiring him to stay 100 yards from Grace and Imani at all times. She referred the physical evidence from the Tuesday in October to the Shelby County District Attorney's Office for criminal review. She made a specific note in her ruling about the pattern of financial control documented in the account records. Darius Morrison was subsequently charged by the Shelby County District Attorney's Office with domestic assault in the second degree. He entered a no-contest plea 11 months later, as part of a negotiated resolution that resulted in 18 months of supervised probation, mandatory completion of a certified batterer's intervention program, a permanent restraining order, and the requirement that he continue funding the joint account, now under Grace's sole and complete control, for 36 months. He did not go to prison. This is the part of the story that Grace will tell you, if you ask her directly, is the part she has had to make her peace with. Not because she wanted revenge. She will tell you she never wanted revenge. What she wanted was acknowledgement. She wanted a record. She wanted the truth in a document that could not be argued away. She got that. Whether it was enough depends on what you believe enough means in a world where women like Grace have been putting their bodies and their futures on the line to get even this much for a very long time. Elaine Morrison was not charged with any criminal offense. There is no statute in the state of Tennessee at the time of this story that reaches what Elaine Morrison did. The law, as it stands, does not have a category for the specific and sustained project that Elaine carried out over 2 years of Sunday dinners and carefully worded comments and strategic absences and deliberate presences. It does not have a category for a mother who stands in a kitchen doorway and watches and does not stop it, and then makes a 7-minute phone call at 12:19 in the morning. Renee Carter has testified before the Tennessee State Legislature twice in the years since Grace's case concluded, arguing for an expansion of the coercive control statutes to reach exactly this kind of conduct. She has not yet succeeded. She has not stopped trying. The house on Whitehaven was sold as part of the divorce settlement. Grace received her share of the proceeds. She did not return to it. She did not drive past it. The silver maple in the backyard, the one she had loved on the first evening she saw it, the one she had told Darius made the whole house feel like a home, was still there when the house sold. Grace said, "Let whoever buys it have the tree. I have everything else I need." Grace Morrison is 31 years old today. She lives in a house on Raynor Street in South Memphis, 7 minutes from Nanabe and 4 minutes from Tamara, and she will tell you that the geography is intentional. She chose those distances deliberately. She wanted to be close enough that the people who matter to her most are never more than 7 minutes away, and far enough that she has her own space, her own choices, her own life arranged by her own hands. The house is small, and it is hers, and she has filled it with the specific choices of a person who spent 2 years in a space where her preferences were irrelevant. There are birds of paradise in a vase on the kitchen table. The colors she chose for the walls are the colors she wanted. The shelves hold the books she wants to read and no others. There is a photograph of her mother on the mantle, her mother holding a bunch of birds of paradise, smiling. And there is a photograph of Nana B. and Grace taken on the day Grace graduated with her social work degree, both of them squinting into the sun and laughing about something the photographer had said. It is not a perfect house. It is a house that required a road in the rain and 14 months of the hardest work of her life to get to. She does not take one room of it for granted. Grace completed her bachelor's degree in social work from the University of Memphis 18 months after Imani was born. She did it attending evening classes 2 nights a week, while Nana B. watched Imani and Tamara came over on the other evenings to do homework with Grace at the kitchen table while their daughters, Imani and Tamara's daughter Maya, played on the living room rug. Nana B. said the arrangement was unnecessary and she had it covered, and Grace should not be worrying about childcare. Tamara said the arrangement was absolutely necessary, and also she was staying for dinner. Grace graduated on a Saturday morning in May, and Nana B wore her good dress, and Patricia Okafor drove in from Germantown, and Tamara brought Maya and a hand-lettered sign that said "We told you so," which Nana B said was undignified, and which made Grace laugh so hard she nearly missed her name being called. She walked across that stage in May with the specific bearing of a person who has earned something not just through study, but through the particular curriculum of a life that tried repeatedly to convince her she was worth less than she was. She had not been convinced. She walked across that stage. She took her degree. She shook the president's hand. She found Nana B in the crowd and held up the diploma. And Nana B, who does not cry in public and has not cried in public in Grace's memory, cried in public. Grace works today as an intake counselor at a family services center in the Whitehaven neighborhood of Memphis, the same neighborhood where she lived in the house with the locked door. She applied for that specific position deliberately. She said, "I know that neighborhood. I know what it costs for someone to get to that door. I want the first thing they feel when they get there to be that somebody in that building sees them." She has been in that role for 2 years. She is, by the account of every colleague and supervisor she has worked with, exceptional at it. Not because she has a gift for the technical aspects of the role, though she does, but because of what she brings to the first 5 minutes of an intake conversation. The clients who come through that door are, in the main, people who have been managed and minimized and isolated and made to feel invisible for a long time. They arrive in the state that Grace knows intimately, the state of a person who is using everything they have just to be in the room. Grace recognizes that state from the inside. She sees it in the way they hold their bodies, the way they answer the first question, the particular exhaustion that sits behind their eyes. And what she does, what she has learned to do, in part from Patricia and in part from Renee, and in part from the specific education of her own experience, is to make them feel, in the first 5 minutes, that they are seen. Specifically, not generally, not with the warm, performed compassion of an institution, but seen the way a person is seen by another person who has been exactly where they are and chose, from that exact place, to get up. Imani Grace Morrison is 3 years old. She has her great-grandmother's complete and total certainty about her own importance in every room she enters, and her mother's capacity for attention, the quality of paying close, genuine, unhurried attention to the person in front of you that Grace's teachers noticed when she was a child at Sherwood Elementary, and that she brought to every child at Little Hands Learning Center, and that she now brings to every person who walks through the intake door in Whitehaven. Imani is, by the unanimous and entirely unsolicited account of every adult in her life, a person who has opinions about everything and is not remotely shy about sharing them, and who treats the world with the complete unself-conscious confidence of a child who has never spent a single night of her life wondering whether someone loves her. Patricia Okafor has been at every birthday. She arrived on the first one with a stuffed elephant that Imani named Patricia and still sleeps with. She arrived on the third one, and Imani ran to the door when she heard the knock and said, "Patricia, Patricia, Patricia," and threw her arms around Patricia's legs and refused to let go for approximately 45 seconds while Patricia stood in the doorway with her hands on Imani's back and looked at Grace across the room with the expression of a woman deciding something very important about whether she was going to cry in front of people. She held it together. She has 31 years of professional composure behind her. But it was close. Nana B is 76 years old. She is, in the combined and harmonious opinion of everyone who knows her, still the most formidable person in any room she enters. She has Sunday dinners at the house on Kerr Avenue every week without exception. Grace, Imani, Tamara, Maya, Patricia when she is not working, and occasionally Renee Carter, who discovered Nana Be's cooking at a holiday gathering 2 years ago and has not found a reason to stop attending. Nana B makes Patricia a plate every time without being asked. Patricia says the plate is unnecessary and she is only staying for a minute. Nana B says, "Sit down, Patricia." Patricia sits down. She stays for 2 hours. She has stopped pretending she is only staying for a minute. These Sunday dinners are not the Sunday dinners of the Morrison house in Whitehaven. They are not occasions that contain, beneath the surface of the warmth, a current of evaluation and judgment and the careful placement of words designed to land in the exact place most likely to cause damage. They are just dinners, loud and warm and crowded with voices and the sound of a 3-year-old demanding everyone's attention and the smell of Nana Ba's cooking filling the house on Kerr Avenue the way it has filled that house for decades. They are the Sunday dinners that Grace could not have imagined, lying on that road in the rain in October, were waiting for her on the other side of the decision she had just made. They were waiting for her. She got up. She found them. "I want to leave you with something Grace said the last time we spoke, when I asked her what she would tell the version of herself lying on that road in October if she could go back. She was quiet for a long time. And then she said, I would tell her that the road is not the worst thing. The road is just the night the previous 2 years ran out of room to hide. I would tell her that the locked door behind her is not evidence that she is nothing. It is evidence that somebody was afraid of what she actually was. I would tell her that a car is coming. I would tell her to stay on the ground long enough for the headlights to reach her, and then to get up, because the woman in that car can stop, and she can help, and she can change everything. But she cannot do the getting up. Only Grace can do that. And I would tell her that getting up is enough. The getting up is enough to start with. Everything else can come after. I sat with that answer for a long time after she gave it to me, because it contains something that I think is true not just about Grace's story, but about all of these stories, the ones we tell on this channel, and the ones that are being lived right now by people who are in the middle of them and cannot yet see the other side. The getting up is enough to start with. Everything else can come after. Before we close, I want to ask you something. Not about Darius. Not about Elaine. I want to ask you about the people who stopped. Patricia, who got out of her car. Nana B, who drove 40 minutes in the rain at 2:30 in the morning without announcing she was coming. Mrs. Caldwell, who kept a notebook for 27 years on the belief that records matter and the truth needs witnesses. Tamara, who showed up on a Saturday with a casserole and not one single word that resembled "I told you so." Renee Carter, who picked up her phone at 2:45 in the morning. These people are not extraordinary in the sense of being unlike us. They are extraordinary in the sense of having decided, each of them, at some prior point in their lives, in some quiet and unremarked moment, that when they saw the shape on the road, they were going to stop. We have all had that moment. Most of us will have it again. The question this story asks, the question I want you to carry out of this video and into your week, is the same question it left with Grace on the morning she was well enough to think clearly about what had happened to her. When the moment comes, are you the one who keeps driving, or are you the one who stops? If Grace Morrison's story moved you tonight, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who is in the middle of something they have not yet found the words for. Share it with someone who needs to know that a car is coming, that someone is going to stop, that the getting up is enough to start with. We will see you in the next one.